Okay, let's go. Item 19, adoption of the technical amendment to the 2017 ATP guidelines. Don?
It's Lori.
Oh, Lori, I'm sorry.
Commissioners, this is an action item to adopt amended Southern California Association of Governments regional guidelines for the 2017 Active Transportation Program. At the August 2016 Commission meeting, the Commission adopted regional guidelines for SCAG. Then in February, SCAG's board amended these guidelines to allow for SCAG to combine multiple small non-infrastructure projects into a single project to be administered by SCAG. This type of practice is encouraged in the ATP guidelines, so staff recommends your approval.
Do you have a second?
Second?
Okay, we have a motion by Modafer, a second by Dunn. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Any abstention? Motion carries. Item 20, adoption of the 2017 ATP MPO component for the 8 of the 9 large MPOs. Lori, you're up again.
Tab 20 is an action item to adopt the MPO component of the 2017 ATP for 8 of the 9 large MPOs. You should have this as a pink item. This item was also posted to the Commission's website on March 13th. As you recall, we adopted the 2017 statewide and small urban and rural components of the ATP at the December 2016 meeting. This item is to adopt the active transportation programs for the following agencies: Fresno COG, Kern COG, MTC, SACOG, SANDAG, SCAG, STAN COG, and Tulare CAG. San Joaquin COG needs more time to work out some of the issues in their program, so they requested that we adopt their program in May.
We have a motion.
The 2017 ATP was the third ATP cycle. There's approximately $263 million in programming capacity available for the program, with about $105 million available for the MPO component. Commission staff reviewed all the MPO program submittals for consistency with the ATP program guidelines and to ensure that the MPO project recommendations were selected through a competitive process. The staff recommendation includes 62 projects requesting ATP funds of $103.3 million. This includes almost $98 million for 55 projects that benefit disadvantaged communities. The staff recommendation is the same as what the MPOs have put forward.
A motion by Tavaloni,
Second?
a second by Dunn. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstain? Motion carries. Moving along, item 21, Garth.
Sure. Commissioners, we're fortunate to have, first of all, tab 21 is an action item, and Ben Metcalf, we're fortunate to have Ben Metcalf, who's the director of the California Department of Housing and Community Development here, or HCD, to provide an overview of their January draft of statewide housing plan that's titled California Housing Future. And following Mr. Metcalf's presentation, we were asking for your approval to transmit a letter, a comment letter to HCD, essentially outlining and providing support to HCD from the Commission on the development of the statewide plan, and then also reiterating the continuing, that the Commission and HCD should continue to collaborate on housing and transportation issues. And staff would recommend your approval of that letter following Mr. Metcalf's presentation. And I'll turn that, Mr. Metcalf.
Hey, Garth, thank you for the introduction, and thank you, commissioners, for having me here today. Again, my name is Ben Metcalf with the Department of Housing and Community Development. I like to think of housing and transportation as the peanut butter and jelly of the sandwich that makes California great. What I want to do briefly is give you just a couple of the highlights from the draft report we put out earlier this year, our statewide housing assessment, which is the first time since the year 2000 that HCD has attempted to kind of comprehensively catalog the state's affordable housing challenges and offer up some policy recommendations, and then offer just a couple of observations about the synergies between housing and transportation. Let me just start with kind of the very bottom line here from the housing perspective, which is that for a host of reasons, the supply of new housing in California has fallen significantly behind what we knew we needed based on economic projections, and also fallen significantly behind what historically we've been able to produce. And this graphic gets at that. About 205,000 homes per year in California for most of the 20th century. But over the last decade, we have entered into a period where we are producing less than half that number, and again, half of what we knew we needed. That has obvious consequences on affordability. That lack of supply is driving up rents, it's driving up home prices, and it's pushing a greater and greater share of California families into something that looks functionally like poverty. 1/3 of renters today paying more than 50% of their income in rent, particularly severe at that lowest end of the income spectrum. And here, this chart captures the idea that when you have a finite supply of housing, the folks with income are able to outbid the folks without, and that puts incredible pressures on that segment at the bottom end of the distribution. Of relevance to this commission is this slide, which gets a little bit at the disconnect between where we have been seeing strong housing production in the last decade relative to where the jobs are. And our research suggests that there is, and likely will continue to be, a bit of a mismatch, which is to say a disproportionate share of new supply is coming in line in the places where we have, we believe, the least proximity to jobs, arguably less infrastructure, less transportation facilities to be able to connect those folks to the services, jobs, amenities that we know they need to be successful in their lives. And this is a good example of how that manifests itself. Although we often think about the affordability crisis as being something that is maybe particularly felt in coastal communities, in fact, when we stack housing affordability on top of transportation affordability, when we look at the share of income that California households are paying for both housing and transportation, interestingly, we see that it's, in fact, some of our inland communities and some of our more rural communities where that hardship is being felt the most. This is as a share of income as well, so we see that many of those are the communities that have not experienced the significant run-ups in median income, making it doubly painful. I'm not going to go through all of these consequences of the housing crisis. For that, I refer you to your spare time tonight as you're trying to fall asleep for the full report, but happy to answer questions on the various consequences that the report chronicles and catalogs. And not to make everybody feel completely depressed, but I do think we have made a number of significant steps forward over the last year, particularly at the state level and at the local level, to identify some additional resources to put forward to this problem, particularly in the realm of homelessness, and some efforts as well to do things like make it easier to build accessory dwelling or secondary units, new legislation that came out of the state last year. And I also would say, I think HCD and our counterparts with CTC, Caltrans, and CalSTA have been very much engaged looking at the connections between our RTPs and our SCSs, implementing SB 375, thinking about what it means to align our housing cycles with our transportation cycles, working to support through participation in advisory committees, the California Transportation Plan, the Freight Mobility Plan, and working to implement a number of programs such as our Proposition 1C TOD funds and the cap and trade, I mentioned this here, greenhouse gas reduction funds that target affordable housing linked to infrastructure. And there is clearly more work that may be coming down the pike. There is a lot of chatter in Sacramento around new housing legislation to try and tackle some of these issues. And I want to just quickly throw up on the slide the principles that the governor laid out earlier this year in his budget for working in housing. Some of this stuff has obvious connections back to transportation, streamlining the housing approvals process, thinking about ways in which we can control some of the costs, and tackling the production incentives that often hold back local jurisdictions from approving housing. And I want to actually read to you a direct quote from the governor's budget on this topic of identifying production incentives. The governor's budget calls out the need for legislation that tackles this issue. Those jurisdictions that meet or exceed housing goals, including affordable housing, should be rewarded with funding or other regulatory benefits. And those jurisdictions that do not build enough to increase production should be encouraged to do so by tying housing construction to other infrastructure-related investments. So in that statement, I think the governor has thrown out sort of a challenge to say, how can we think about this in an integrated way? We're integrating our planning at the level of the RTP and the SCSs, but how do we actually think about rewarding jurisdictions through tying some of these funds together? And lastly, new funding sources for affordable housing. So these are a set of principles that the governor has laid out. I talked about the housing element and RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process. I'm not going to get into the detail of how that all works. Probably some of you are familiar with it already. Needless to say, we are gearing up in the next couple of years to launch into another round of our RHNA process for allocating the 180,000 units per year that we know we will need. We are also spending a lot of time trying to think about how we can make sure that we're getting good data about what's actually going on out there in terms of jurisdictions for meeting the planning numbers they've set in terms of actual production. One of our challenges has been, in addition to actually getting compliance on housing element, actually getting good reporting. It's something we're going to continue to be working on. And just as a conversation piece, one item that we've been talking a lot about and looking at in terms of a success story, we believe, is the work that has happened both in San Diego and in the Bay Area in terms of linking infrastructure investments to compliance with housing elements. So have jurisdictions done the planning that's required under state housing law and the reporting that I talked about. I would love to look and discuss further if there are other opportunities along those lines that would be productive for continued collaboration and coordination between the housing and transportation sides of the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So with that, I will stop and open it up for questions.
Commissioner Burke?
Just a couple of comments. The availability of the tax credits is having a real impact in terms of low and moderate income production. And I think that as we look at transportation goals and we identify resources, we do have to coordinate those two things, because you have a whole industry in terms of the low and moderate income industry that is often at a disadvantage. So it becomes very important, and recently they've talked about changing some of the criteria for the credits. So I hope that we work together, because just like 375 brings the two things together, we need to coordinate and to also have our efforts going in both directions.
Yeah, speaking on behalf of Mark Stivers and the Treasurer's Office who administers that program, I know he would welcome further conversations to look at how we can make sure that where we do have competitive allocations of credits,
Right.
those are going to the communities that have the infrastructure and the amenities. I think there are some point scoring efforts in there already that go in that direction, but I'm sure that they can be tightened. And I have been speaking with Mark about a number of ways that we can better direct those funds to the communities where you have opportunity and amenities, and I know we have good work we can do there. Thank you for that comment.
Commissioner Gometti?
Madam Chair, thank you. Ben, thank you for the report. You and I probably should spend a day together because I'm the home builder in the crowd. And I don't want to take up too much time, or literally I could be here all day. Let me just give you two examples. There are many pebbles in this stream that are blocking housing production. It's not just one issue, but starting with fees, we pay on a single-family house anywhere from $60,000 to $110,000 in fees just before we start anything. And that's a big hit to affordability. It's a big hit to production because not many people can afford the higher price range. But on the transportation side, which I'll put this hat back on, we've got some bad players in land use. In the Bay Area, I'll cite three examples for you. In the Alameda County, we have BART that's extended out to Pleasanton. The city of Livermore is the next town. They want BART extended to them at the end of the system. And they have basically a no growth policy on anything north of 580. So they want the system, but they don't want to take the population. And the land that's out there is very, very poor agricultural land. There's no water source for it. It's basically dry land farming. The second example I'll give you is in Marin County and Sonoma County, where we're building and it's due to open soon, a SMART train that starts a little north of Santa Rosa. It'll eventually, the initial phase will end up in San Rafael, and within 2 years, it'll connect to the Larkspur Ferry, which will take you into San Francisco. So this is another mass transit system. The growth or land use policies in Marin and Sonoma County and the various cities are very restrictive. So there's very little housing being built up there for a system that the taxpayers have paid a great deal of money for. The third example I'll give you is probably the most telling, is the city of San Jose. South San Jose is restricted politically from being opened up. The city of Morgan Hill has tremendous growth control constrictions, very difficult to do anything with. And the city of Gilroy is not much better. We have a Caltrain that starts in Gilroy every morning, goes up into the heart of Silicon Valley, and eventually all the way into San Francisco, where the most pressing housing needs facing the Bay Area right now are for Silicon Valley employers and people who work there and in the city of San Francisco. And those are all political decisions that you don't control and I can't control. And eventually, I guess, in some instances, the state needs to take further action and maybe take land use control away to get those areas to open up for much needed housing in the Bay Area. But I would be happy to sit down with you and go through the rest of my list at some point in time. Thank you.
Just very quickly to respond, as I think we've seen a lot of discussion lately with the new AB 32 climate change bill coming out of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research and other places to say, as we think about how California solves its climate change efforts, we need to think about shifting patterns of land use to lower GHGs. I think the tendency that I often hear is that means, well, we need to stop producing housing in our natural and working lands. But there is another piece of that, which is we also need to think about how to actually increase construction and density and development in our areas that are proximate to our transit cores. And I think there is and probably needs to be a role for the state in doing that. I would say we are also challenged by having fewer carrots around even housing element compliance than we used to. With the exhaustion of Proposition 1C funds, jurisdictions have fewer incentives now to want to comply with our housing element laws. And I glossed over it in my presentation, but the governor has called for increasing compliance and accountability, figuring out how we can really make cities follow the minimums of the fair share housing law that we have in place. I think that's very important. So thank you for your observations. Welcome the chance to spend a day with you. All right, calendars can be arranged.
I'll be there.
Yeah.
Commissioner Dunn.
Thank you, Director
Yeah.
Metcalf. Ben and I have had a number of conversations. I've been honored to, as a former housing director, for he and I to banter back and forth in the differences 10 years ago, 13 years ago to today. And so, and I commend you because it's a very tough spot that you're in now. 10 years old, SB 375 required that we plan housing and transportation together. And in that 10 years, I would say that I would give us an F for doing that effectively. There are cities that will contend that they have successful SB 375 stories to tell, but when you just scratch the surface, it's absolutely smoke and mirrors. No one has taken advantage of any CEQA exemptions that were offered. And so we know transit tends to work better when you intensify development, a la a Manhattan, where transit ridership is actually probably one of the few places where it's actually increasing in the nation. And so as you look at those housing opportunities to intensify development, we have to convince the administration that we're fighting that whole state trying to get to the heart of increasing housing supply. And we're not just at affordable, we're now at middle-class housing, as you and I have talked about. This is really serious, where we're losing our millennials to.
Right.
So we've now invested in their education to go to other states. I mean, it's just every place you push, this is the central issue for so much of the business community, is making sure we figure out how you succeed. So in any way, connecting the dots with we get how we need to intensify development in urban centers, but the mantra has been, what, drive until you can qualify?
Right.
And so I would really like to see us think about how can we create job centers around transit modes, as opposed to thinking, let people live where they can afford, for God's sake, but let them work at job centers in transit areas so that they can commute in, as opposed to our freeway centers. I see more like transit-oriented housing development, and now that's getting the buzz because you have emissions issues, right, to deal with there. And then the other issue that is, I don't know how you intensify development without CEQA modernization in an urban area, and the moratoria that exists out there, it's just now blossoming. So a city of Newport Beach, where I live, that instituted a green light initiative 20 years ago, sent their growth to Costa Mesa, who just initiated their moratoria on development, and that is now, rolling. So again, that we're at a loggerheads of state recognizing the importance of trying to meet climate change goals versus local control.
Right.
And man, oh man, are we going to have to be the most diplomatic people on both the transportation side, but the housing side, to see how to get that to work, because it's just a huge battle, and I know you're in the middle of it, and I appreciate your leadership in trying to get some right ideas. For going forward, I think we've also talked about how we could make transportation funding also work with housing.
Yeah.
Incentivizing communities to build housing. I mean, redevelopment is dead. Huge issue that helped us build housing. The transportation funding, or the housing funding you mentioned, is like, it's a pittance, like our transportation funding.
Right.
It's a pittance for what we need. And so if there's any way we can figure out how to leverage funding like bike lane money, ATM money, to encourage cities that we give them extra points if they're in compliance with housing element, or whatever metric you want to use. I think that would be helpful going forward as well. And I'm certainly willing, as a commissioner, to work to figure out where those connections might be best beneficial. So again, thank you. Miserably tough job, and appreciate your leadership in doing it. And both personally and professionally, I'm here to be your partner and cheerleader.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. I think, Commissioner Gilmetti's comment about 60 to 110,000 before you do anything, before you buy any land. I just, until we can get our arms around everybody and their brother putting another fee on, I mean, Commissioner Dunn's drive till you qualify, we're all going to be driving to Nevada, I think, and meeting ourselves coming and going. So I do think
The fees are a lot cheaper up there, by the way,
Yeah, fees are.
Pardon me?
in Nevada.
I know, I've been there and done that. Thank you.
Henderson is
Yeah.
calling.
No, but it's complicated, and appreciate the work that you all are doing, and think there's definitely challenges for all of us, but we really need to roll up our sleeves, I think, and get some common sense so we can have not all of our young millennials that are getting their education and bailing from our state. So I think that's a tragedy for all of us. And then the hearing on the Oakland fire today, I think, points out how folks find different alternatives for housing that are less than desirable, I think, in terms of a safety perspective. So we got to watch that as well. So,
And if I may, I do think there is some cautious cause for optimism. I mean, there are examples of jurisdictions that are, I think, doing a good job of implementing their SCSs. And we're really trying to get more aggressive about allowing density in urban areas. I was very pleased recently to note that the City of Los Angeles has proposed a very significant density bonus going up to 50% of the totals in areas that are immediately adjacent to transit hubs as they work to implement the Proposition J, I think it was JJJ, that was implemented last November.
since the S was defeated, otherwise
Yeah.
we would have been stopped cold
Yes.
for 2 years.
Yeah, but S was defeated, which would have put on the kind of limitations
Yeah.
that prevent growth.
Alrighty, thank you, Ben.
Sure.
So let's move on then to.
Excuse me, Commissioners.
Sorry.
Yeah, we-
Action item, and I
Oh.
move staff recommendation for the letter in our packet.
Second?
Thanks for keeping me honest. Okay, any more
Second.
discussion? Okay, we have a motion by Dunn, and I think Burke seconded it. And so all in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Motion carries. Sorry, thanks. Okay, item 22, now we can move on.
Yes,
to
Commissioners.
Dawn?
Yes, so tab 22 is an information item to present the draft guidelines for the California Freight Investment Program. This item provides an opportunity for staff to explain the process undertaken to develop the guidelines, outline key areas, and allow for additional public input and discussion. The draft guidelines, as provided to an attachment up to the pink book item, which Doug is now handing you, the draft guidelines show the key changes as compared to the discussion draft which was released on February 23rd. A quick program background, the FAST Act established the National Highway Freight Program, which provides the state approximately $582 million over a 5-year period. SB 826 requires the Commission to adopt guidelines to describe the policy, standards, criteria, and procedures for programming and allocation. In addition to the federal funds, AB 133 provided $11 million in state funds, which will also be administered through this program. A brief overview of the process that we've gone through so far. Staff initiated the guideline development process with a kickoff workshop in November 2016. Additional public stakeholder workshops have since been held in a variety of locations with teleconference options. Staff has also presented at the California Freight Advisory Committee and met with various advocates prior to releasing the discussion draft on February 23rd. 2 additional workshops are scheduled for April 3rd and April 24th. We have received several comment letters, which are included as an attachment to your book item. Staff recognizes the concerns raised in the various comment letters and will continue to work on addressing those concerns through the additional workshops and other opportunities prior to formally submitting the final guidelines to the Commission in May. A quick overview of some of the key topic areas. Participants felt the proposed December 2020 deadline did not allow sufficient time to develop projects, so staff has revised the guidelines to show a December 2022 date to award. The MPOs wish to have a role in screening and making initial recommendations to the Commission, so staff has revised the guidelines to include that language. Many of the regions felt the proposed 50% match requirement was too high and would eliminate some of their projects from being able to compete for the funds. Staff has lowered the match requirement to 30%, which will continue to leverage funds and lessen the burden on local agencies. Many of the participants are not in agreement with the 40% statewide target for Caltrans and felt it should be 25% as it is currently for the interregional program. Staff continues to propose the 40% after considering 60% based on the traditional amount of federal funds that go to the state. We also considered a 50% based on SB 826 language that requires the Commission to allocate to regions and the state. Staff also believes the 40% balances the need in the interregional program, the administration's priorities, and supports the language in 826. Additionally, the guidelines include language for Caltrans to provide a level of geographic balance. The last key item, several regions request the regional programming target percentages be the same as the TCIF percentages. The TCIF was based on the now 10-year-old Goods Movement Action Plan and priorities at that time. Under AB 14 and federal statute, the state is required to have a comprehensive freight plan to govern the immediate and long-range planning activities, as well as capital investments. The current Freight Mobility Plan was approved in 2014, which replaced the Goods Movement Action Plan. Staff utilized the network tiers and projects in the Freight Mobility Plan to determine the proposed programming ranges for each corridor. The percentages represent a low to high range for potential programming, but does not limit what the commission may program in order to provide for a level of geographic balance. Staff also added a Central Coast region based on stakeholder input. Earlier today at the RTPA meeting, we did get feedback from the regions regarding the project list in the Freight Mobility Plan, and they were amenable to possibly updating that plan for us to revisit these percentages. So staff will work with Caltrans to see if we can make that happen within the time frame. In conclusion, staff would like to thank the many individuals representing a wide range of government and advocacy groups who participated in the guideline development process and look forward to continuing discussions over the next couple of months before presenting the final guidelines in May. I would be happy to take your questions now or as speakers come up.
So we have a number of speakers, so how about if we have our speakers first, and then we'll ask our questions. So first up, we have Michael Cano from Metro, who's going to give us a speed round presentation of the Southern California Consensus Group with his peers, I think. So,
yes, thank you, Vice Chairman and Commissioners and staff. Appreciate this opportunity, and I am speaking on behalf of the Southern California Consensus Group, which comprises the 5 Southern California counties and 2 ports and 3 of our railroad-related public agencies. And I have many of them in the back there, so I just want to make sure that they've spent a long time here, want to be represented. Thank you for the chance to work with your staff and to help provide input into these guidelines, both during the many months, but also with the letter we submitted to you with our many concerns relating to guidelines and our desire to continue working with you to improve upon them and make them as equitable as possible for the regions. We recognize these draft guidelines are a starting point, and you have already incorporated some of the concerns we had, but we still have some issues with a couple of the items we'd like to bring to your attention. First off, thank you for providing more flexibility on local match and for allowing for the extension for the construction start date for two more years. We did ask for 2023, if that is possible, but 2022 is a great compromise at this point, and we appreciate your moving in that direction. We also want to thank you for allowing public construction agencies to be eligible to apply for projects. We are still concerned, though, on one of the issues with the projects that are receiving pre-construction funding, in that they may not be ready for submittal for construction by 2022. So perhaps if there was a nuance put in there that would allow those projects to have a little more leniency so they can actually get up and going and be able to go to construction without having that construction start date be applied to them directly. And we also do want to make sure that we note that we would like the funds that we've previously expended on projects for other phases of the project to be included as part of the match, if at all possible. Our main concern is with the targets for the regions. If you noted in your packet, those targets are based on a new paradigm of a CFMP with the Tier 1, but based on project costs. And we looked at the different projects, and when we developed the CFMP from the different regions, it wasn't our understanding that this would turn into new targets, especially based on project costs. We think some of the projects that are on the list may skew those numbers, unfortunately, one way or the other, away from targets that, as different regions throughout the state, we have worked with very well, and we've have pretty strong consensus that those original targets, which are on in your packet on page 2 with the chart, would represent pretty fairly how we view the need to allocate funds throughout the state. So we would definitely want to make a clear point of returning those targets back to the TCIF targets for now. And then we also recognize that we do need to revise and update the CFMP to reflect a better understanding of the projects and also new projects that should be included in that Tier 1. For example, in LA County, Measure M did pass between when the CFMP was provided and today. We have 3 years worth of developments on projects. So we would like to work with the state to go through the CFMP and try to revise it and make it and clean up a bit and bring it up to a level of currency. But we don't want that to influence the targets we're working for under this program. So we appreciate your support, if possible, for using the TCF targets from a very highly successful program which you have administered that all the regions are pretty much very comfortable with to begin with. In terms of the state share of the CFIP, we understand that the state does want to participate and have an ability to be partners with us in the allocation of these funds. We did offer 25% as our request, matching the STIP allocations. And one of our things we wanted to note was The state projects mirror very clearly what we're developing at the regional level. I think most of the state's projects are basically what we've already developed as priorities with their own regions, so we're not sure if there's that much lack of overlap between what the state would like to do and what the regions have been developing for years. So we would like to see that amount go down to 25%. But also in terms of how the state allocates its funds, we do appreciate the notion of equity and to make sure that the state does try to program those funds in a way that is equitable throughout the regions. But if the state does decide to put all those funds into a certain area, then we do ask the CTC to exercise discretion in maybe reallocating the targets for the regional side of the funding to provide statewide equity for the entire pot of funds if Caltrans would like to put the funding in certain projects that may skew the distribution of those funds against the targets we have currently. We want to put that out there and have your consideration for that. In terms of the MPO's role, one of the issues we have in Southern California is we have many counties, many agencies, and the MPO does have to go through an extended process to get a vote and to have a public action. Our projects are all part of the MPO-approved RTP, and so we would like to limit that down to, maybe a letter of concurrence or something that's an administrative action, not something that would require a whole vote of our MPO to have to go through to tell our counties and our different agencies whether or not our projects are part of the list coming forward. We work very closely together in Southern California and have for many years, and we'd like to keep that spirit of cooperation going with support for what the guidelines require from the MPOs. We do also want to make sure that if we go to corridor targets, that we do keep the foundation that if you have cost savings on your projects, that they're reinvested in the corridors. We've worked very hard within our region to try to bring down costs and to reinvest those funds because we know this coming back to our region and work collaboratively to make sure that we have the best projects forward and eliminate as much as possible any cost overruns. We know there's a limited amount of funding and the need to get that funding out and leverage it as much as possible. So that incentive to keep costs down through this mechanism would be appreciated to be included as part of the CFIP. We also wanted to ask, given that there's a potential for this commission to maybe take action in September, we would appreciate extending the deadline to submit projects to July 31st, as well as mentioned previously by our counterparts up north. It just is a lot of work and a lot of time to organize and to get a regional consensus list of projects up there, and that extra month would do a lot of good for us. And so we appreciate your discretion to allow us that extra month, knowing you have your deadlines to meet to turn this into the federal government. Lastly, I just want to note that this letter, which is signed by 11 agencies, is really a testament to the TCIF process and how that has allowed all of us across county lines to work together and to develop partnerships and to work within a framework that has been very successful. And we'd like to keep as much of that framework as possible, especially with the targets, so that we can continue delivering for the state and working with you as a partner to make sure our projects are moving forward on a dedicated fashion and also with collaboration, so we're not competing against each other. I mean, this morning we had the pleasure of meeting with several of you at the port complex, and you saw firsthand just the massive projects we have there, the importance of the movement of freight through the ports. But that story for Southern California, as you well know, doesn't just end there. It's the freeway systems, it's the rail lines running through LA County and out to Ventura, to Riverside, Orange County, and San Bernardino counties. And so we have a lot of needs and a lot of requests, and we appreciate the fact that the TCIF process has allowed us to work together, and we hope that our comments are incorporated into the next revised draft. And we continue to look forward to working with you at the many meetings to come to try to fine-tune this document so that it meets the needs of the regions and also allows us to work hand-in-hand with the state. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Any questions for Michael while he's up here? Okay, we're good. Stand by in case they come back. Okay, next we have Jared Sanchez. Is Jared here? And Jared, I can't read your writing to see exactly who you're representing, so if you'll
I'll
tell
state
us.
it, for sure. Hello, everyone. It's Jared Sanchez with the California Bicycle Coalition, also a part of the California Cleaner Freight Coalition, CCFC. There's a coalition of groups across the state working on environmental justice issues. First, just want to thank CTC staff, especially Mitch and Don, of course, for having the workshops, being so open to discussion and comments, and having those incorporated so quickly through the process. So thank you for that. As part of CCSC, we've been a part of all the workshops, had quite a bit to add to the conversation, and we think the guidelines are going in the right direction overall. We've already submitted, I guess, quick comments into the guidelines that were mostly incorporated into the draft revised, so we're very thankful for that feedback. We are also really supportive of CTC working with ARB around the quantification methodologies and developing air quality impacts assessment for all the applicants who submit to the project. So we want to make sure that's lifted up and completed in time to ensure that's a part of the CFIP. Just a couple of concerns, of course. There are, of course, will be for anybody making a comment here, but there's a few things in mind. The first one, of course, is a Sustainable Freight Action Plan. There's already been substantial incorporation of it into the draft guidelines. We just hope to see more, especially around, of course, giving priority to certain eligible projects, and certainly would think that in light of not just improving community and environmental impacts, but also improving the freight efficiency at the same time. The Sustainable Freight Plan, there are several examples in that. We would love to see incorporated in the guidelines that projects may be able to follow and have priority. The last couple of things, there's also a mention of a private and public cost-benefit analysis. We'd love to see that strengthened in the guidelines to include some important equity impacts for all of the communities along these freight corridors who suffer, of course, disproportionate burdens from air quality and emissions. And then lastly, we would love to see some priority to projects that include and provide meaningful community engagement with a lot of the community groups working along these corridors who are already actively engaged in a lot of local campaigns and struggles that directly reflect the community residents undergoing so much of the burden along the freight corridors. So we'll hope to see that further reflected in the guidelines as well. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Any questions for Jared while he's up here? Okay, hearing none. Doug Ito from the Air Resources Board. Doug?
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Doug Ito with the Air Resources Board. Really, my comments focus on appreciation to Commission staff and the amount of work that they've done with us, not only on this particular item, but also on the California Transportation Plan and other planning documents that you've been tackling the last year or so. The FAST Act, the California Freight Mobility Plan, MAP 21, the California Sustainable Freight Action Plan, these are all things that we've been talking about for the last several years that have helped California define where we want to go on freight and freight policy. Executive order from a couple of years ago, B3215, was released and really partly motivated, I think, by Commissioner Dunn's advocacy of multi-agency coordination on topic areas like freight. Pushed us into an era of really communicating and talking across agencies on these issues that have multiple impacts, not just on the transportation system, but on the system of systems, including economic, including environment. And I think out of that came a set of vision and guiding principles in the Sustainable Action Plan, which I was pleased to see was added to the document in this last revision. And we want to underscore the importance of those guiding principles in helping to identify criteria and ways of evaluating the projects that come forward. As the guidelines indicate, ARB is working with CTC staff in developing standardized methodologies for applicants to reflect the air quality impacts. We're excited to do that. We're pleased that staff reached out to us and has been very open to all the conversations that we've been having with them. We're encouraged by the continued partnership that we have with the Commission. I know that this is a topic of much discussion, but we also support the inclusion of the programming element target for Caltrans in this document. It's not only consistent with the broader statewide priorities that we've been discussing over the last several years, but we believe it promotes strong state and regional partnerships. So in conclusion, just thank you again, and I appreciate the ongoing coordination and look forward to continued discussions with your staff. Thank you.
Any questions for Doug while he's up here? Okay. Thank you.
One last soundbite. The state also just put out the annual report for the GGRF California Climate Investments Program. It's the documentation of $1.2 billion worth of state funding that has gone to greenhouse gas reduction projects across the state, including those related to transportation and the CalSTA's program. So if you haven't seen it, check it out. It's really cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Okay, and Kenneth Cow?
Thank you, Commissioners. I'm appearing wearing my MTC and Northern California Trade Corridors Coalition hat. I think a lot of my earlier comments I still agree with, and also I agree with Michael's comments from LA Metro. I just wanted to expand on two topics. First, thank you to Commission staff for agreeing to consider some of the newer plans that might have been developed since the adoption of the 2014 Freight Mobility Plan. I think that would be really helpful. Absent that, I think also we could go back to the TCIF numbers and work on a kind of a revised funding split from that. I think, at least from the Northern California Coalition, we're looking at the splits and we noticed that our share is about the same as our friends to the extreme south in the border region, which seemed a little odd to us since the Bay Area plus the Central Valley plus Sacramento is about 38% of the state's population, while the border region is about 9%. So just wanted to highlight that. Second thing was related to the timeline delay. I just realized that the September town hall meeting is in Mono County, and I think it'd be kind of pleasant to visit Mono in September. So just a little plug to see if we can delay the adoption until September to give the MPOs and our regional partners a little bit more time to make sure we have a very open process and give you the best projects available. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kenneth. Questions? Commissioner Gometti?
One brief question. The town hall meetings aren't a full meeting, so you may not have a full commission there to do any action. Okay. Are we ready to?
Yeah, we're ready to have commissioner questions, I think.
I had a question over the award deadline. We've got in there December of 2022. That I'm going to be a real old man by that time, but I don't know. I don't understand why it takes that long. I mean, it's 2017 now, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. So we heard.
Yeah.
Any other questions? 5 years,
So,
Jeff. 5 years.
You know, I'd like to consider making this 2020 instead of 2022.
Yes, so we, based on the input that we received from the regions, for the projects that they felt they needed to apply for these funds, they felt they needed some additional time. So by pushing it to 2022, that leaves us 1 year under the federal statute to actually use the money and get it obligated to a project if there's any delays or projects that's not able to come in time.
That's 5 years from now. It seems.
5.5.
Yeah.
It's very fast.
Well, why can't we just make it 2020? I don't see people jumping up and
as staff, I would defer to the regions. We're happy to make it 2020, sir. I think it's a question of what projects they could deliver that are in their plans.
We have some comments coming forward, I think.
Thank you, Commissioners. I think from our perspective, the trade programs are very complex in a lot of cases. We have to work with railroads and other partners that take a little bit more time. Secondly, we are interested in pursuing pre-construction type projects to tee up for some of the larger projects. And so a longer deadline for award would help us achieve delivery of the pre-construction and leverage additional funds in the future for
You know, we put the TCIFs together pretty quick.
We did, yes.
You know, you have a big, brand-new office building over there, you should be able to produce this thing.
Good one.
No comment.
In addition to the comments by my colleague, if you look at the Fast Lane program, which is the flip side of this coin, the projects were supposed to go to construction by 2022 from this last cycle. So it's taken a long time to get projects up and going, especially going through the environmental process. We've looked at our roster of projects that are even in the first tier that are ready to go, and 2022 is the necessary timeframe. We need to make sure we have a roster of projects that can compete for this funding. If it was 2020, the number of projects we would have that will be eligible for this process would be diminished greatly. So it's more of a matter of practicality, not just in terms of the project development process, but also the projects we actually have in hand that are ready to go forward. And our projects, a lot of them are state projects. For example, highway projects that are Caltrans's projects at LA Metro. Those are going to require the extra 2 years to be able to meet the window. So we appreciate the question. Thank you.
Commissioner Madaffer?
You know, I have to respond on a couple of these things. It'd be great, we could wait till 2030, and then maybe everybody will have their projects ready to go. So I think we have to be sensitive to the fact that, while I understand 38% of the population might be, or that one speaker indicated, you got to look at the fact that we talk about wanting to export goods out of California. Mexico is the top export destination for goods out of the state of California. And we've got border projects that are ready to go now. You know, Otay Mesa East is a flagship project for increased freight capacity and mobility for the entire state of California. And frankly, San Diego region appreciates the support of the governor's office on that. 90% of all cross-border trade is carried by trucks. 90% of all cross-border trade is carried by trucks. And right now, those trucks are sitting anywhere from 2 to 5 hours at the border. And so any investments at the border are going to greatly offset these wait times and address what the FAST Act is calling for, as well as the state's vision for freight projects that address our sustainability needs. You know, and there's also other areas in freight investment and highway improvements and freight connectors in the San Diego region. I understand there's some disparity. People want to wait longer. But, you know, if we're talking about wanting to move goods, if we're wanting to talk about reducing GHG, there's some projects here that, from my read, look ready to go.
Undersecretary Ennis.
Sure. Well, thank you for the chance to comment. I did want to reference that Secretary Kelly has a letter in your packet. It's actually dated January 18th, so I believe it was before your prior commission hearing, but did want to reiterate and expand on a few points here. You know, the state does have priorities in this area. Commissioner Madaffer mentioned the Mexican border and some meetings the governor's had over his administration with counterparts in Mexico and wanting to improve the border region. Doug Ito mentioned, of course, some of the Sustainable Freight Action Plan priorities. We also have some rail safety issues mentioned in Secretary Kelly's letter. So certainly there's a lot of priorities all around the state, and both state and local, and in the end of the day, often once the guidelines are done, which is often the most challenging part of these efforts, you know, I would have to think all these projects will be both state and regional priorities that get programmed and go forward. This issue has come up several times today of the state-local funding split, so I don't want to be silent on that one. I want to reiterate again that in the governor's May revision, we tried to kind of take a real straightforward approach to this and proposed a 50-50 funding split. We didn't go with the higher traditional federal fund split. Thought 50-50 was a good place to go. We did in our letter mention 40% state amount and talked about negotiations with the legislature that somewhat informed that. We did go from our 50% in the May revision to a smaller 40% with the provision that those were flexible for the state. So we went down, but we wanted to maintain the flexibility to do some important state priorities. So wanted to mention that, and I think these are, of course, a draft that will be further discussed, but in the most recent draft, had a little concern with what seemed like a very rigid geographic requirement on the state that might not allow the state priorities mentioned in the letter to be met. So do want to work certainly going forward with the commission staff on that point. I do believe geographic equity is important. I mentioned the agency values that and delivers on that. This morning I mentioned the letter to the federal government on our priority projects. Also in our transit capital, we've been very key on that. So I believe we can get there on an acceptable geographic diversity, but I do want to certainly call out that where we started was 50% state. Went down to 40%, thinking that would be with significant state flexibility to issue or to focus on some state priorities. So want to end with compliments to the commission, because I know this is, as I said, some of the toughest work staff does is working with so many stakeholders all around the state to get these guidelines right.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? I, too, just want to add my thanks to our staff and to all of our other partners who have spent countless hours on this. As you all know, I spend a lot of time focused on freight issues, so I'm delighted that so many folks are rolling up their sleeves. It's tough. I think one challenge for all of us is it's given the sheer size of investments we need on the freight sector, this isn't a lot of money. And not to look a gift horse in the mouth, but we need a whole bunch more. So I think we're all kind of thinking that whatever transportation deal may be put together, that a lot of the work we're doing now could potentially apply, but I guess we can't count the bird till it gets into our hand. But I do want to just thank everybody. I think we still have some issues. I'm hoping that we can find consensus. I was around with the 1B discussion and the first Goods Movement Action Plan, and I tell you, the benefits of having our regions sit down together on a regular basis is priceless, in my opinion, when it comes to the freight sector. So I really want to encourage all of us to continue that with our partners, whether there are Caltrans partners or state partners at the Air Resources Board, or our port partners, or the private sector partners. And we really haven't heard from any of our private sector partners today. And I've tried to encourage them to participate. I don't know that we've had great participation. I think our railroads have been at some of our workshops, but this is a sector that is dominated by public-private partnerships, in essence, in terms of the investments and how the system of systems work together. So I think whatever we can do to encourage us to get as many folks into the discussion to figure out how to best leverage, because even though we do for the first time have some dedicated freight funding, it's nowhere near the investments that we need. And if we get those fast lane grants, that'd be really helpful from round 2, since round 1 was a little bit short when it came to the California allocations. But I think that's a big question mark for all of us. So I just want to add my thanks, and I think maybe Malcolm or Brian Annis?
I'll yield to Commissioner Gamodi.
I was going to make
Okay.
a motion, but go ahead.
Okay. It is just information, yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add is I don't want to lose perspective that this is a program established in the FAST Act for National Highway Freight Program. And it's for projects of national significance that are going to be really important for the movement of goods, for the state of California, and the United States. And California played a pivotal role in creating this program in the FAST Act. And I think that the guidelines that are laid out by the commission staff really do prepare a good framework for a good partnership between the state and the local partners. Thanks.
That's the only reason I was so passionate about freight and the border, because it's national.
Commissioner Gometti?
Since an information, I would like staff to consider that the award date to 2020.
May I?
Yes, Commissioner Burke.
You know, I realize that it does take time for some of these projects, and perhaps it could provide that there could be some ability to give some additional time for those that, for circumstances beyond the internal operation of the actual, whether it's probably might be some of the private businesses that have the problem, or it might be actually the governmental entity or the local unit. But if they have a reasonable basis, that there be some ability for them to get additional 2 years. Just some process where they could, if under circumstances that are beyond their control. If you have no objection to that.
No, I mean, if they come in and they've got a DTSC problem they couldn't get resolved in
Right,
time.
all kinds of things that might
I
happen.
get that, but we ought to set the deadline so this thing doesn't keep going
Right.
on and on into the future.
And
Okay.
just as long as there's a mechanism to overcome circumstances that are beyond the agency itself's control. If they're not on the ball, then that's terminated at 20. But if they have other external issues.
Susan?
Commissioners, I was just going to add, your comments are very helpful for staff, and so we will take those comments back to the regions and work through the guideline process and see if there's something that we can't work out with the guidelines to accelerate these projects and delivery, and, you know, just kind of put the feet to the fire, but allowing for some discretion, some comeback if that's necessary. So, thank you.
Okay, April 3rd and April 24th, right? Is that correct, Dawn?
That is correct, yes, the next
Okay.
two workshops.
So we'll make sure everybody has those dates, and
Yes, they're posted on our website, so they are there, and the locations are posted also.
okay, so stay engaged, please. Everybody, we still have a lot of work left to do, but thank you all for getting us this far down the road. Okay, wow, we got to pick up some speed here. Item 23, why are you laughing at me?
You're funny. Yes, Commissioners, the next,
Okay. Thank you, Stephen.
the next 13 items, 23 through 35, are the information calendar. These items don't raise any issues. They will not be discussed unless specifically requested by a commissioner. Hearing no requests from commissioners, we'll move on to the consent calendar. The next 15 items, 36 through 50, are the consent calendar. I need to make the following correction to the calendar. We need to pull item 42, which is the resolutions of necessity. We only have 7 commissioners, and we need 8 commissioners to do resolutions of necessity. With that correction, staff recommends that you approve the consent calendar.
So moved.
Okay, we have a motion by Commissioner Arp, a second by Commissioner Tavaloni. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Okay, motion carries. We are now on to
Item 51.
policy matters, 51.
Yes, Commissioners, item 51 is the 10-year State Highway Operation and Protection Program Shop Plan and the 2017 5-year Maintenance Plan. By statute, the department is to present its shop plan and 5-year maintenance plan to the commission by January 31st of the year. As Undersecretary Annis noted, the plans were not received by the commission until just this Friday. Since there's not much time for the commission staff to provide the commission to provide comments on the 10-year plan, staff recommends that the commission postpone review of the draft shop plan to formulate comments until the May 17th, 18th commission meeting. That would be staff's recommendation as to what happens with this item.
Madam Chair?
Well, we have a presentation queued up, so.
Well, legislatively, I know Brian said that it got hung up in their office. Well, why didn't we get this by January 31st? What was going on?
Well, as I mentioned, we connected this to the transportation funding proposal and wanted to make sure that this was a document that was fully consistent with and supportive of the governor's funding proposal. So we did circulate it, we did review it. That added some time. We didn't build that time in to the longer timeline, so that's why I believe it was 5 weeks beyond the statutory deadline.
It took you that long? Time is money.
So I think we have a brief presentation. Do you want to?
Well, I would suggest that if you're going to follow staff's recommendation and hear this item at the May meeting, then we might as well save the presentation for the May meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we can do that. So
Motion to
we
move it to
had a
May.
motion to move it to the May by
I'll
Commissioner
second that.
Medaffer, second by Commissioner Burke. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Okay, we go.
Chair, just one note that I don't know if we might also have to consider sending a letter to the legislature, because we have a duty to take action on this, if I recall. So we might let them know that we didn't get it in time, so they're not getting our approval in time, and make sure that we let our leaders know, if that makes sense.
Commissioners, we had a few of the commissioners on the Project Delivery Committee. We talked with the commissioners about this. Subsequent to that, I spoke with Director Doherty and was assured that Caltrans would not submit the final SHOP plan to the legislature until receiving our comments. And with that, would you also, I guess I'm looking at Director Doherty, will you be transmitting a cover letter explaining why it's delayed and that the commission did not have, time to provide comments within its scheduled meetings?
So the department has the obligation to submit the draft by a certain date and the final by a certain date. The final is supposed to be May 1st. We want to make sure that there's adequate time for commission staff to review and commission to comment and provide comments back, and us to incorporate those comments. We have no problem in waiting till the end of May to allow you to address this item in the May meeting. It's our obligation, and we'll make sure that we're diligent in informing the legislature as to where we are in meeting our statutory timeline to make sure that you have adequate time to provide comments. We can handle that.
So, Commissioners, I do have one question for Director Doherty that I have not talked with you about before. How does this work? The two plans, the maintenance plan and the State Highway Operation and Protection Plan, are now combined into one document. And statutorily, the maintenance plan is provided in a final form as of January 31st to the legislature and the governor, I believe. So how does that transmission work? Have you already provided the maintenance plan in final form as required under the statute? Or, because it is one document, that's what I'm procedurally trying to understand your submittal.
I'm leafing through my pile of papers. If you go back to your presentation on legislative items, there's a piece of legislation that lines up these different deadlines such that this document, so that we can take a needs assessment, 5-year maintenance plan, 10-year SHOP plan, and an investment plan, and combine it into one document and share those all in one document, which is a very good way to go forward. There are some deadlines that need to be aligned, and there's proposed legislation that would coordinate those different documents. This is exactly what we should be doing, and consistent with sophisticated asset management, is combining all this information in one document.
Right, so I do agree with that. I think my question is, though, under existing law, how does it work?
Well, by submitting this document, we'll be able to meet the 5-year and the 10-year, the 5-year maintenance plan and the 10-year SHOP plan requirements. This document will suffice to satisfy both those requirements.
So, Malcolm, are you going to submit by May 1st, or you're not?
We will not submit on May 1st to allow the CTC to provide comments and discuss at your May meeting, and we would like to target the end of May to turn that document in, which would give us an opportunity to incorporate any comments you have.
So is it my understanding that staff received this report Friday night?
Friday, pretty much close to business.
Okay, so clearly no one's really had a chance to review it. I think it is, I support the rest of the commission's feeling that we need a little time to absorb this. But given that, I'm wondering why we wouldn't want to go ahead and hear the presentation. I know we've already had a motion on it, so I guess I was a little slow on that uptake. But after I listened to this, it seems to me that at least hearing the presentation would give us a chance to absorb what they have to say about it, and then,
I'll withdraw my second then.
I'm okay with that.
Okay, come on back.
I was just phoning my Uber for the airport ride. So,
left the room.
thanks, Chairman and Commissioners. I'll try to make this very brief. We talked about the Streets and Highway Code requirement for this 10-year plan and the 5-year maintenance plan. They are updated every other year in accordance with law. What makes this year challenging is that we have the government code requirements for asset management, SB 486 changes, that we have to also bring into play. The State Highway System Management Plan, which is the integrated plan that we've been discussing, incorporates the performance targets established by the Commission. It implements the new performance measures required under federal law for pavements and bridges. It integrates maintenance and shop needs in an asset-centric way that I think will be considerably more intuitive to understand what is actually happening with the system out there. In addition, it provides an unprecedented level of transparency. And while the transparency is a very welcome thing by most people, it has had an indirect effect of providing enough information for a lot of questions to be raised that have historically never been raised with respect to the 5 and 10-year plan. I'll talk about one of those examples here. But I've talked before about this idea of threading the needle between all of these things. So the department has to comply with all these various constraints that are coming from all over. And this plan does that. We've accomplished it. I regret that it's late, but I certainly hope that doesn't diminish the accomplishment that this plan represents, because it is very good work. We talked a little bit about the difference in the Commission's role with respect to reviewing the different pieces, and that's been a point of a lot of discussion between Caltrans and Commission staff. The 5-year plan is simply transmitted to the Commission. The 10-year shop plan has a review and comment period, and then the asset management goals and objectives and the approval of the TAMP as a whole has Commission approval authority. So we need to get this resolved, and I think Malcolm mentioned some legislation that would do just that. What you have in the book item, though, is somewhat of a hybrid where we've taken the complete plan and we've excerpted out those pieces that are the 5-year maintenance plan and those pieces that are the 10-year shop plan to allow the Commission to fulfill these various roles under the current law while still retaining the authority to revisit targets granted to them under California Government Code. I know this sounds very complicated. Believe me, we've been working through this quite a bit. I think once we get past this transition year and we get into a regular diet of integrated asset management plans, this will become much cleaner in future years. As far as the needs go, there is a couple things that I think is really important to talk about. And I will offer, as this has been the topic of a lot of discussion, if the Commission desires, I would be more than happy to hold a workshop for those commissioners that are interested and walk the commissioners through the plan between now and the May meeting, if that would be helpful and something the Commission wants to do. Specifically, I'm going to focus on the shop in the interest of time because that is where the commission has the direct authority for review and comment. I presented in December on the needs assessment. I presented in January on the investment plan. We've been working regularly with commission staff. This has been a long haul process. We've been at this for 9 months to get to this plan to where it is. So it is unfortunate that it's a little bit late, and we'll make sure that doesn't happen in the future. As far as the needs go, there is one important development that took place between my prior presentation in December and now, and that is a discussion of the rate that we use to escalate the future construction value of our needs. So I'll try to make that as simpler. When we do a needs assessment, we look at where the condition is today, and then we look at the commission targets that were set, and the difference between those two is a gap. And that is the gap analysis that's required under the provisions of performance management under federal regulations. For this plan, we go one step further and we price out what it would cost to close that gap. That is the needs assessment. So the commission established a goal. We said this is where we are. To close that gap is going to cost a certain amount of money. That unit price that is used to calculate that cost is in today's construction dollars. But when we look at the 10-year plan window, the first 3 years of that 10-year plan are already programmed in the 2016 shop. Those projects have escalation built into their programmed amount. The next 2 years after that are in our planning work plan, what we call our K-phase work plan. They also have escalation built into their project costs. So the unmet need, if you will, all gets pushed into the last 5 years of this plan. That need has to be escalated to anticipate the value of construction at that point in time. So when we do that within this plan, we escalate to year 7.5 of the plan, which is the midpoint of that last 5 years. So when I presented in December, we used an escalation rate of 4.5%. That is the rate that is current in the current fund estimate. Now, the line this very squiggly line that's shown on your screen here is the highway construction cost index for the last 20 years. And you could see that in the early portions, it was a fairly steady growth up, and then it started going crazy. Things like 9/11, the recession, other things that are occurring economically were driving costs all over the place. But under this approach, and this is one of those things that during the review process came out, we are in effect doing a future value calculation to back into that rate, and we're only using the first year and the last year's point, and everything in between gets ignored. That approach was called into question during the review of this plan. Questions came up like, well, why are you using the last 20 years? Why don't you use the last 10 years? Well, if we use the last 10 years, then that rate becomes 1.5%. After looking at various alternatives, we came back to an approach that actually uses a best fit curve, which is the smallest deviation we can have from the cost index over that entire 20-year period. In other words, this 3% approach minimizes the deviation for all 20 years. The impact of changing this escalation rate is that when we estimated these construction values, we're starting at a fixed point, but then we're compounding at 7.5 years at different rates. And that gets you to a point where your needs are different in the end, depending on which one of these escalation rates you ultimately select. Between December and now, we have evaluated all of these various options and had the dialogue that was previously probably unspoken because this was not transparent, and we are now recommending this 3% curve. The impact of going from a 4.5% escalation to a 3% escalation is about $8.5 billion in need over a 10-year period. It doesn't change the work that needs to be done, but the value, the estimated or projected construction cost of doing that work is less in this final plan, as you're going to see it. A simple way to look at it is to look at these three lines. The low line, the green line, is the 1% curve, the blue line is a 3%, and the 4.5% is what is currently used in the fund estimate. If we start with $1 of need in 2017, you can see that at that low end of the curve, we're going to be up to about $1.10. If we go up to the 4.5% line, we're going to be up to about $1.40. When we multiply that kind of inflation factor by tens of billions of dollars, it adds up to a lot of money. So I wanted to call the Commission's attention to this because it's an important fact, and it had the impact of reducing the estimated construction value of the total needs from what was presented in December, $97 billion, to what is in this final plan, $86.5 billion. For the investment plan, in effect, it was unaltered from my previous presentation to you, because while the escalation for the needs assessment has a significant impact, the investment plan has less, because so much of that investment portion is already escalated and it's already committed and approved by the Commission. The main takeaway here is that the amount of money that we have available, $26.6 billion over this 10-year period, is being largely earmarked for fixing the existing system, i.e. fix it first, rehabilitation, preservation of the existing system, and a significant chunk for safety. There is a portion for system performance and a portion for sustainability. Those sustainability portions are largely driven by stormwater compliance mandates and resiliency items for bridge scour mitigation and bridge seismic mitigation. So that is the proposed plan. It's laid out in great detail. There is also a section in the plan that that itemizes specifically what we anticipate can be accomplished, and a projection of what the end state condition will be for the state highway system given this investment level. While we can do a lot of work with the money, the picture on a larger scale is not particularly rosy. The amount of money that we have available is driving decisions that are cheaper to implement, where we can do them on a broader scale of the system. However, their lifespan is very short. We are forced into that kind of asset management model because of the lack of money to go out and rehabilitate and do things in a more of a long-term fix approach.
Okay, so can I just interject right here? My intent was to have you just give a couple of highlights, because what you're going through right now is probably more suited for the workshop that you were mentioning after our staff has had a chance to evaluate and make some comments, and then we can sit down and kind of go through the weeds, because I don't think we're going to be able to absorb all of this right now when we still have to look at the whole report. I do have a question for Malcolm. I'm trying to get the significance between the difference of the deadline between January 31st and May 1st. You seem to say that there was some deadline for you that was actually May 1st.
Well, actually, the statutory deadline for adopting the 10-year SHOP is May 1st.
So what was January 31st?
The deadline for adopting the 5-year maintenance plan.
Oh, okay, and because you...
Did I get that right?
Yes, and providing the draft to the Commission for comment.
Oh, and the draft of the 10-year SHOP. That's correct.
Okay. So I guess my recommendation would be that staff, once you have a chance to evaluate, are you permitted to go ahead and give us that before the next meeting to review? Or do you have to wait? And I mean, do we have a chance to at least review your comments on it sometime between now and the next meeting?
We should be able to provide some kind of our thinking and comments to you ahead of the meeting, yes. And then during the meeting, that would be publicly aired.
Okay, and then if after that, we think that there might be some value in having a workshop to walk through some certain questions, we could schedule at that time. I'm not committing us to that at this point, but I would suggest, having gone through this then, that we submit our own letter as to why we're doing this.
Right, staff will prepare a letter to transmit to the legislature explaining why we're missing the deadline. And staff will also prepare comments and analysis of the document, share that with the commission. We'll bring that back to the May meeting. And if, depending on the nature of the comments provided, we would expect that Caltrans would review those comments and incorporate those to the extent you deem appropriate into the final shop plan that's transmitted.
Do you need a motion to that effect, or are we good?
I think we're,
Do a motion.
is this an action? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can direct us. That would
If
be
I can
great.
ask the chair and the executive director, why would you not be transmitting that letter to the department? We
Well-
have statutory requirements. We'll be informing the legislature of the disposition of us meeting those statutory requirements. We want to make sure the CTC has adequate time to review, comment, and discuss to submit those comments. Why would you not be submitting that letter to the department informing of the timeline that you would like to have to make sure you have adequate time?
It
I'm
would-
fine with that if we don't have a statutory requirement of our own based upon the review.
It's our statutory requirement.
Commissioners, what I would request is that Director Dougherty provide us a letter assuring us that the commission's comments would be considered in the final document that is transmitted. Because at this point in time, what we're working against is a deadline, a statutory date that a draft would be provided to the commission on January 31st for comment. And right now, we know that as staff, to the commission, that the commission's comments will come in after the statutory deadline at which Caltrans must submit the final document. So it would be helpful if Caltrans would submit the commission a letter so that we know that our comments would be considered in that final draft document, or the final
More than
document,
happy
not
to
the
do
draft.
that.
That would be helpful. And then, then I would suggest to the commission that a letter to the legislature is not necessary.
Okay,
And that was the original.
okay, fine.
We're more than happy to submit a letter to you.
Okay.
Okay,
But-
thank you.
The question I have, with the focus on fix it first, if we went in, let's be Pollyanna here and optimistic, and we're going to get a nice transportation bill, we would totally alter this plan if we went in and fixed a whole bunch of stuff, because our degradation schedules are all based on business as it was in the past, right?
If I could comment on that one, that was one of our internal debates, whether we should hold this until we get the funding package approved and build in those outcomes from those particular dollars. Of course, we decided to go ahead and put it out. When the commission does start reviewing this report, there is a summary of the additional accomplishment for a system that's achievable with really either of the three funding packages, Senator Bell, Assemblymember Frazier, or the governor's package on page 4. So with that additional funding, there's fully 17,000 lane miles of additional pavement fixed over 10 years. There's additional 500 bridges fixed, 55,000 culverts fixed over 10 years, and 7,700 TMS elements fixed. So with new investment over 10 years, you do have a significantly improved outcome relative to what you see in the base plan. And while you don't meet all of the funding needs across all categories, by focusing on the 4 elements that the CTC focused on for the asset management plan, the highest priority assets, you do achieve significantly better outcomes.
Okay, so I think we're finished on this one for now. Are we done? Okay, so the motion, can we have the motion again?
Well, it wasn't my motion originally. You had an earlier motion that.
We withdrew it.
Oh, you did?
Okay, let's do a new motion, and we've withdrawn anything that's on the table right now.
The original motion was just to punt this to May. It sounds like Ms. Branson wants some additional caveat in the motion.
Susan, do you want to try the motion?
So, Commissioners, staff would recommend that the commission defer providing comments at this time to allow staff to formulate comments and bring those forward at the May meeting. And in addition, staff would recommend included in the motion would be that commission staff would work with Caltrans to obtain a letter to assure the commission that the final plan will not be submitted until the commission's comments are provided.
And so that you will have an opportunity to collaborate with Caltrans on
Correct.
that letter.
Correct, so that the
we
commission
won't-
knows at the end of the day that the commission's comments will be incorporated into or considered in the final document. Because I believe Commissioner Dunn raised a concern that we have an obligation to comment on that plan within the statutory timeframe before it's finalized and submitted. And right now, by providing comments at this meeting, we cannot provide comments in time to inform that final document. So we want assurance from Caltrans that they will consider our comments before transmitting the final document. So that wasn't a very good motion, but if that helps you formulate that, yeah.
Do you want to try to summarize that, Commissioner
Oh, just say.
I move that your comments are a good motion, which I support.
Second.
Doug, do you have that motion in some words that make sense?
Move staff
Okay.
recommendation.
Okay, move staff recommendation was made by Commissioner Arp and seconded by Commissioner Dunn.
And one piece of discussion, Madam Chair?
Okay, sure.
Is just to make sure that then we are also going to be calendaring this in our May meeting. Right, okay,
And a workshop if desired,
if necessary, yeah.
if necessary. Okay. So all in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Okay, motion carries. Oh, phew, okay, so it's now 5 o'clock somewhere.
Clock here.
Okay, we are on now, what?
Item 52.
52?
Yes, Commissioners. Item 52 is a policy for asset management plan development. It all goes along with the prior discussion. Staff is working on a policy. Right now, we are still finishing the final touches on the policy. We still want to discuss the policy with Caltrans first before we present it. So again, staff would be asking that we defer action on this item until the May meeting.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Motion carries. Okay, item 53.
Commissioners, tab 53 is an action item requesting an increase in the reservation funding to address emergency damage on the state highway system. Please note that this is a yellow replacement book item. The reservation for fiscal year 16-17 in the commission adopted 2016 SHOP is $155 million. In the first half of the fiscal year, we had a relatively normal level of damage, and then the storms hit in January and February. An additional $500 million in reservation funding for fiscal year 16-17 is requested to a new total of $655 million. Please also note, as part of the book item, the department is also committed to report at your May 2017 meeting how these emergencies affect project delivery. Staff has reviewed the request and recommends your approval.
So move.
Second.
Okay, we had a move down there, I believe, by Gilmetti, and a second by Tavaloni. Any discussion? I just had a question where Malcolm mentioned $730 million worth of damage from the last storm, so is this enough?
I would suspect that the number that the director had referenced includes other items in addition to SHOP. SHOP is not the only way to address damage.
Okay, okay, just want to make sure we have enough, okay. All in favor of the item?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Motion carries. Okay, let's go on to 54.
Commissioners, tab 54 is a request for approval for 4 items. An amendment of 63 new projects into the SHOP. These are primarily the emergency damage restoration projects. Please note that there is one change, and then one project is modified from fiscal year 16-17 to 17-18. Number 2 is a change to scope, schedule, or cost on 15 projects in future years of the commission-adopted 2016 SHOP. 3 is the addition of one long lead project, which is a project that takes longer than the 4 years within the SHOP to develop. And the last item is a revision to performance measures for 39 currently programmed projects in the commission-adopted 2016 SHOP. This aligns with the approach to update the measures to align with our asset management approach. Staff has reviewed the proposed new projects and changes with the department and recommends your approval.
Second?
Okay, we had a motion by Tavaloni, a second by Commissioner Dunn. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Motion carries. Okay, minor program allocations, 55.
Commissioners, tab 55 is a request for allocation of $4.34 million for 5 minor projects. As noted in the change list, these projects were not on the June 2016 Commission-approved minor listing. Since they were not on that original listing, these substitute projects require an allocation action from the Commission. Staff has reviewed the project and recommends your approval.
Okay, a motion by Commissioner Madaffer, second by Commissioner Tavaloni. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Motion carries. Item 56.
Commissioners, item 56 is a request of an allocation for $1.2 million for one minor project. As noted on the change list, the project was not on the June 2016 Commission-approved listing. Since it was not on the listing, this requires a Commission allocation item. Please note the changes in the revised book item on the cost. Staff has reviewed the project and recommends Commission approval.
So moved?
I have a motion by Commissioner Dunn, a second by Commissioner Tavaloni. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Motion carries. Next item, 57.
Commissioners, tab 57 is an allocation request for $102 million for 13 SHOP projects programmed for delivery in the current fiscal year. These are now ready for allocation. Staff has reviewed the projects to confirm the readiness and recommends Commission approval.
So moved.
Second?
Motion by Commissioner Arp, second by Commissioner Dunn. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Motion carries. Item 58.
Commissioners, item 58 is an $8 million allocation request for 2 SHOP projects. This is a financial contribution for the relinquishment of a portion of Route 74. There are 2 projects since a portion of this relinquishment is in the city and the remainder is in the county. The related item referenced in the agenda is the relinquishment resolution. The department has determined that this relinquishment is in the best interest of the state. Staff has reviewed the request and recommends Commission approval.
We have a motion by Commissioner Madaffer, a second by Commissioner Tavaloni. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Motion carries. Item 59.
Commissioners, item 59 is an allocation request for $11,455,000 for one project in fiscal year 17-18 in the Commission-adopted 2016 SHOP. This is an advancement of a project that includes a retaining wall to stabilize a slope alongside the Pacific Coast Highway in Los Angeles County on State Route 1. Staff has reviewed the request and recommends Commission approval.
We have a motion by Commissioner Tavaloni, a second by Commissioner Burke. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? The motion carries. Okay, I think we're ready to head to day 2 on the agenda, starting tomorrow on item number 60. So we will be heading to the WTS Mobility 21 LA Chamber reception, right? Thank you all.